Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a seriously fascinating piece of modern religious history. We are taking a close look at the Jehovah's Witnesses, and specifically, we're exploring a pretty wild correlation. How incredibly complex mathematical formulas used to predict the actual end of the world, directly triggered a massive sociological shift toward authoritarian control within the organization. It's a story all about intense faith, broken chronologies, and honestly, the very human reaction to failed expectations.
Here's our roadmap for today. First up, we'll look at the history of the apocalyptic disappointments. Second, we'll break down the actual math behind calculating the end. Third, we'll explore a dramatic insider fallout known as a crisis of conscience. And finally, we'll wrap up by examining the cost of loyalty.
All right, Section 1, the apocalyptic disappointments. Let's rewind a bit and look at the early days of the Watchtower Society.
So the early era of the organization was heavily defined by this relentless focus on setting highly specific dates for the end of the world. They went through these intense, repeating cycles of expectation. The founder, Charles Taze Russell, initially pointed to 1874 as the date of Christ's return. But when a physical return didn't happen, well, the doctrine shifted to an invisible presence. Then, the focus moved to 1914 as the end of the Gentile times. World War I came and went without the apocalypse, so new dates were set, like 1925, and later a massive buildup to 1975. Every single one of these dates represented a peak of sheer anticipation, which was inevitably followed by crushing disappointment among the members when, the world kept right on spinning.
Now, what's truly wild about this history is just how literal these expectations were. Take the 1925 prediction, for example. This wasn't just some vague spiritual metaphor. The organization was expecting the literal, physical resurrection of Old Testament patriarchs. We're talking Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, walking around in the 1920s. The anticipation was so real that they actually built a sprawling mansion named Beth Sarim in San Diego in 1930, built specifically to house these biblical figures the moment they returned to Earth. I mean, they literally had the keys ready.
Let's fast forward a bit to 1975. Calculations determined that this specific year marked exactly 6,000 years from the creation of Adam. Excitement reached an absolute fever pitch. Baptisms actually skyrocketed, increasing fivefold leading up to the date. But when 1975 came and went just like any other year, the fallout was severe. It sparked a mass exodus. So to manage the crisis, leadership had to pivot. They basically argued, well, the calculation for Adam's creation was correct, but there was an unknown time gap before Eve was created. So essentially, the 6,000-year clock didn't officially start until Eve existed, which conveniently pushed the apocalypse back indefinitely.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, calculating the end. How on earth did they come up with these exact dates in the first place? Let's decode their foundational 1914 doctrine.
This formula functions almost like a giant mathematical mystery box. Here's how it works, step by step. Step 1, their starting line is the destruction of Jerusalem, which they date to 607 BC. Step 2, they look at the book of Daniel, which mentions a period of 7 times. Using a prophetic calendar of 360 days per year, 7 times equals 2,520 days. Step 3, they apply a day for a year theory. This turns those 2,520 days into 2,520 years. Step 4, if you start at 607 BC and calculate exactly 2,520 years forward, you arrive precisely at October of the year AD 1914.
But, and this is a huge but, this math hits a massive brick wall right at the starting line. The organization absolutely insists Jerusalem fell in 607 BC. However, extensive secular history, archaeology, and ancient cuneiform tablets universally date the fall to either 587 or 586 BC. The problem is, if you use the historically accepted date, the entire mathematical formula derails. Those 2,520 years would completely miss 1914. Yet the organization has to maintain that 607 BC date as an absolute non-negotiable fact to keep the whole framework standing.
So why does getting to 1914 matter so much? Because this specific math birthed a major modern doctrine. Referencing the Gospel of Matthew, leadership taught that the specific generation alive to witness the events of 1914, specifically those who were at least 15 years old at the time, would literally not die out before the world ended. As you can imagine, the simple, relentless passage of time put immense strain on this teaching. As we got deep into the 21st century, that specific 1914 generation naturally just aged out of existence. And that prompted some very deep, unavoidable questions from within the congregation.
Which brings us to Section 3, a crisis of conscience. What happens to a highly structured religious organization when foundational prophecies are repeatedly proven wrong by the calendar?
We actually get an unprecedented, behind-the-scenes look at this exact scenario through a man named Raymond Franz. Franz wasn't just your average member. He was a high-profile member of the governing body. That is the absolute highest echelon of leadership. In 1980, right in the middle of all this internal turmoil, he was expelled from the religion. 3 years later, he wrote a landmark autobiographical exposé called Crisis of Conscience. In it, he completely pulled back the curtain, detailing the secret, intense internal struggles over these very dating doctrines during the 1960s and 70s.
Franz painted a really complex picture. He didn't frame the leadership as these malicious supervillains. Actually, he argued they were basically kind, well-intentioned men. But he revealed that their doctrinal decisions were becoming more and more driven by a desperate need to avoid organizational embarrassment over these failed predictions, rather than by sound biblical study. Preserving the institution's authority, he noted, took priority over transparently admitting to the congregation, hey, we got the math wrong.
And that leads us right into Section 4, the cost of loyalty. This internal crisis of confidence directly fueled a dramatic sociological shift within the group.
It is a complete 180-degree turn when you look at the history. In the early Watchtower Society publications from the late 19th century, members were actively encouraged to study independently. The literature back then explicitly warned against formalized organizational control. But as the decades rolled on and as these prophecies required constant reinterpretation and damage control, the structure completely flipped. Today, the modern governing body is tightly centralized. They demand total adherence to their official interpretations, and they actively punish anyone who questions them.
The overarching philosophy driving this drastic shift was summed up perfectly by the organization's own legal counsel, Hayden C. Covington. During a 1954 Scottish court case, when he was pressed on the organization's demand for conformity, he flatly stated, "We must have unity, unity at all costs." That single phrase, unity at all costs, really became the defining operational standard for the leadership moving forward.
And to enforce this unity at all costs, the organization relies heavily on a highly controversial practice called disfellowshipping. Here's how it works. If a member, guided by their own reading of scripture or history, expresses personal convictions that go against official Watchtower teachings, they can be formally expelled. And it doesn't just end with getting kicked out. They are strictly shunned. We're talking total isolation. They are completely cut off, socially and spiritually, from their community, their lifelong friends, and even their immediate family members who are still in the religion.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we are left to ponder a really deeply profound question, one that Raymond Franz himself clearly wrestled with. Does demanding absolute, unquestioning loyalty truly protect a community's faith? Or, by enforcing unity at all costs, does an organization ultimately silence the very personal, God-given conscience it originally set out to guide? It's a heavy question about the balance of power and belief, and one that absolutely continues to define the legacy of the Jehovah's Witnesses today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.